In 1985, you were elected to the ANC's NEC at the conference in Zambia. Shortly after, you wrote a paper about how the ANC should go about preparing for negotiations with the apartheid regime, and another paper rejecting a one-party rule and arguing for the ANC to support a Bill of Rights and a system of multi-party democracy. Can you tell us more about your thinking at the time on these important matters?
It's the same paper, actually. Well, we had built up, to the conference in Kabwe in 1985, and that was in the context of what was happening on the ground here at home, beginning with that attempt at establishing the tri-national, what is called tricameral parliament. No? Yeah, there had been the mass uprisings virtually in every urban area. Then early in 1985, the ANC had also called for the people to make South Africa ungovernable and apartheid unworkable. That's the context in which we had the Kabwe conference. So to everyone, it was very clear that we were sort of reaching end game in many respects, that the crisis of the regime was deepening. The international isolation of the regime was reaching a critical point as well. And one had to look at, well, what's the future, right? And then you also needed to galvanize the ANC's own support inside the country and consolidate it, because it was clear by 1985 that the ANC in many respects was emerging as the dominant factor in liberation politics. Everyone who was interested in change in South Africa wanted one way or another to relate to it. So in a context like that, one needed to, I felt, spell out in much clearer terms what the way forward would be. And there was then the so-called Buthelezi Commission, which was looking at a new dispensation, a PW with his tricameral parliament, and there were various other debates inside the country about the future of South Africa. There were also various feelers that had been made towards the ANC by people who weren't representatives of the regime, but whom one knew were acting with the regime's knowledge and were probably reporting back to the regime about discussions that they'd had with the ANC. So that was the context. ANC President O.R. Tambo said, we need a briefing on what's happening in terms of all these constitutional proposals, and so on and so on and so on. And it was in that environment that I then wrote that paper. I titled it The New Face of CounterRevolution, because most of the constitutional proposals that were emerging from inside the country, from various think tanks related to the regime, their intent was to thwart what we were trying to do, to thwart the struggle for democracy, to make it, anyway, to defeat its purpose one way or the other, which is why I titled the paper New Face of CounterRevolution. So in it, one analyzed then what was being said and what was being proposed, why they were proposing it, and I concluded the paper by saying we need to spell out in much more clear terms what freedoms the ordinary South African would enjoy when we implement the Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter, it's broad strokes, if you like, right? But, you could interpret it any way you wanted. So what did we mean, for example, when we say the people shall govern? Does it just mean that you'll have an election, as was said by various pundits, and others here that, oh yes, we know about African states, one person, one vote, one time, right? Is that what we mean? People shall govern? Or do we mean something else? So spell it out in very clear terms. Also, when you say, for example, in the Freedom Charter that there will be freedom of political expression, etc., 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 what does that mean? Does it mean that there will be one party in government and, well, within the framework of that one-party system, you can say what you like? Or does it mean a multi-party system? Right? Does it mean, for instance, you will illegalize certain forms of political advocacy, like racism, anti-Semitism, fascism, etc.? So we had to spell those things out. And that was what the paper proposed, that we should break that down in much more definite terms. The argument being also that we had, in a sense, to preempt the middle ground, you see, as the movement. So that those political and other forces inside the country who were sort of in dubiety, do we go ANC, do we go with the regime, do we go with someone else, would have a clearer idea of what the ANC's intentions were, so that the dubiety would disappear and those that were genuinely interested in a democratic dispensation would tend then to cleave to the ANC side. So it was both strategic and tactical, the purpose of the paper.
After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, you and Joe Slovo both issued papers about your respective views on socialism. This entrenched your reputation as a socialist, but one critical of the SACP. Could you reflect on this exchange of views that you had with Slovo?
Well, I suppose the exchange, Slovo was a very good friend and comrade. Both he and Ruth, when she was alive, were good friends of mine, social level, but were also political comrades. And, you know, one had been in discussion over years about socialism, the meaning of socialism, etc. Joe was then one of the leading lights in the, well, I suppose he had been for a long time, in the South African Communist Party. By that time, I think he was General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, the period you're talking about. And he produced a paper which was published as a pamphlet called Has Socialism Failed? I felt that it was deficient in very, very many ways, because while it was saying, yes, socialism as it was practiced in the Soviet Union was not attractive and maybe that's why it's come to this, it didn't explain why what had happened in the Soviet Union had happened. And I thought that was very deficient, because if you couldn't explain why socialism went in the direction it did in the Soviet Union, how would you prevent that from happening in, for instance, if you then went in the socialist direction? And also, in what respect would the socialism you advocate differ from what had happened in the Soviet Union? You had to come up with those explanations. So that was the basis of my response to Slovo's paper, Has Socialism Failed? I think he maybe thought I was a little bit tough on him, because he did become a little bit defensive, and he responded in various ways which I thought were interesting, to say the least. And well, we did engage, I suppose, in another exchange after that on the issue, because I was asked to do a survey of South Africa's response to his pamphlet. Now, what was good about Slovo's original pamphlet, Has Socialism Failed, was that, in a way, it broke important taboos which the South African Communist Party had been observing for a very long time. criticism of the Soviet Union was frowned upon in many of the communist parties, but especially in the South African Communist Party. One of the reasons was a weird, I suppose, response to the solidarity that we were getting from the Soviet Union. Many people felt these are good friends. Look, they're training us, they're giving us the weapons, they're giving us this, they're giving us that. They supported the United Nations. How can you say these things about them, right? Yeah, I mean, there was that sort of, no, these are good friends, sort of like you would respond to scandals in your own family. Keep it here, don't talk about it outside, etc. Now, the trouble with that is that everyone else outside your family is talking about the scandal, right? And you're denying that there is a scandal in your family isn't helping your family at all. In fact, it's compounding matters in your family, that sort of denialism. I mean, that was my argument, you see. So in terms of breaking those sort of taboos, Slovo's paper was very important in that it now opened up that sort of discourse inside the South African Communist Party. And then the response from other people inside South Africa, communists and non-communists, many who consider themselves Marxists of various stripes, was also very interesting, because they too had to then wrestle with what the meaning of socialism was. Yeah, in that respect, the debate it generated was very, very significant. One's contribution to that, I hope, was helpful. I don't know, it's up to others to judge.
After '94, you were in and out of Mandela and Mbeki's cabinets. What do you think were the issues that caused you to experience President Mandela's disfavor? And in general, how would you reflect on your experiences as a cabinet minister?
I don't think I earned Mandela's disfavor. There were issues on which I differed sometimes with colleagues in cabinet, and the issues on which I differed with the president himself, both inside and outside cabinet. So, I don't think that earned me his disfavor, but maybe he didn't like it, I don't know. So what was the other part of the question? What was our experience? No, well, that first cabinet was, of course, very interesting. A, because it was our first experience of government, all of us in ANC. And it was, as you know, government of national unity, with old NP characters there, IFP as well. Interestingly, in terms of, because we, that first cabinet, the seating arrangements had to be done purely in alphabetical order. Opposite sides of, alternating sides of that cabinet table. So I ended up sitting next to Puk Botha in cabinet for the first few years. Interesting character. Now I would say that first cabinet probably entailed getting to understand where the other side was coming from, who they were and where they were at. The thing that amazed most of us when we became ministers was the culture of obsequiousness that you had in the apartheid civil service. I'd never come across people behaving in such an obsequious manner to their superiors. I mean, it was quite shocking. And that said something about the internal culture of the National Party and the apartheid regime. I remember going on a trip to, well, somewhere, Western Europe, and one of the junior members of the diplomatic staff in the country, holdover from the previous regime, saying to me, you know, things are so different now. And I said, why? And he says, no, you know, in the past, we weren't allowed to ever voice your opinion. If you were a junior, we were supposed to sit in the corner and shut up. You know, opinion did. I mean, now we're actually invited to say something in meetings and so on. Really? The experience wasn't one of much contradiction. We, ANC, I think, did most of the running because we had the policies and we knew the direction in which the country had to go, which I think is why after the second year the NP withdrew from the Government of National Unity.
In 2003, and after the September 11 attacks in New York, he wrote that the US was a threat to New World Order. Given the United States' current political position and Donald Trump's address at the UN General Assembly recently, do you still believe it poses such a threat?
The United States is a very complex society. When Trump presented himself as a candidate for president and then won the Republican nomination, my response was, my God, if this man gets to be president, we'll be in a world war within 1 year. I didn't think he would actually be elected. And I remember my response because there's, you know, the huge time differential. So when we're waking up here in South Africa in the morning, it's still nighttime in California. So you turn on the television and you get those first results, and they're all from the East Coast. And I said, oh, come on. I'll turn it on at 5 this afternoon and, you know, we'll see what really happened. And then you turn it on at 5 and I say, what? They elected Donald Trump? How? Why? Right? And you start saying, well, prepare yourself for disaster. I'm relieved he hasn't plunged us into war yet. But as you can see, the bellicosity and you know, the sort of posturing he does could easily go in that direction. Perhaps we are fortunate in that both China and Russia don't want war, and I don't think anyone actually wants a war, and will therefore exert what pressure they can on the North Koreans not to push things further. But the interesting thing is when, you know, this phase of this conflict with North Korea began, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, amongst other things, said he thinks that the stronger and maturer side should take the first step to de-escalate the conflict. And it was North Korea that did that. So maybe we should think about that too, that North Korea might be the mature of the two sides.
Now, you also tackled Zimbabwe's land claim issues back in 2004 and stated that moral claims by Africans to land in Zimbabwe were unimpeachable.
You see, I very strongly support ZANU-PF thrust of land reform. What I was critical of was that ZANU-PF felt that they could only attain their land reform measures by using undemocratic and anti-democratic means and by subverting their own achievements. My arguments were always that we should not write, which is what everyone tends to do, and speaks like as if British colonialism was democratic. It wasn't democratic. And that is, you know, that is a nonsense which should be hit on the head very, very hard. Democracy arrived in Zimbabwe the day that national flag was raised after Bob Mugabe was elected president. That's when democracy arrived in Zimbabwe. So it is ZANU-PF's achievement. So when you acting in anti-democratic fashion, you are spitting on your own achievements. That was my argument. And it remains my argument to today. When Morgan Tsvangirai came and visited South Africa and he came to Parliament, one of the audiences he sought was with the chief whip of the ANC, who was then Tony Yengeni. And Tony asked me to sit in on the meeting. And I asked Morgan very straight. And after he'd given his spiel about how nasty Bob was and so on, I said, yes, what is your stand on land reform? And he was equivocating. And I said, well, I'm sorry. Bob might be doing unpleasant things, but if you can't address the problem of land reform, you are not a liberatory force in Zimbabwe. That was what the War of Liberation was about. If you, and the posture of MDC is that the whites should retain the land, then not in our club, baby. You're outsider. All right, I didn't say I give Bob a pat on the back for what he's doing to you. No. What my insistence was please, ZANU-PF, don't spit on what you have achieved. Don't undo what you have done.
In 2012, you wrote that Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa was expected to bring various acumen to the ANC leadership, including business, trade union, and political skills. Do you think, given the chance, Ramaphosa will be able to lead SA onto a new political path of growth and development, which will include those who have been left behind?
Well, I think he has a skill set which is not very usual in our movement. He has the skills, I think, and the political acumen. And, he's a smart guy. He's a very smart guy. So, yeah, he could. But that particular article, which was written just before the Mangaung conference, I was actually talking about this emergent black capitalist class and middle class, which, I don't know, one had hoped would perhaps bring a new ethic to South African business and the South African business community. And one fears sometimes that rather than them bringing a new ethic, they are being absorbed into the culture of the white minorities business ethos. You see, which, as you know, brought the country to near disaster. So what one was saying in there was, like Cyril, you the man who was a trade unionist, you business person, politician, all right. You seem to be the guy who has all the skills. First of all, to influence this black business community in a particular direction, and because of the prestige you enjoy in the broader business community, to actually do what we would like to see happen. New ethos, new ethic in South African business. This is a challenge you should take up. Maybe he listened to me, which is why he's running for president.
Now, this book comes at a time where the ANC is facing internal struggle and is in need of self-correction. Do you think your writings are relevant today in this case?
The ANC is always engaged in turmoil. Sometimes heavy duty, sometimes not so heavy duty. And that's what happens, I think, in a living, creative political movement, that there's always debate, argument, etc. Right? So that there's nothing new in that. In terms of the need for self-correction, the ANC has been able to do that quite a number of times. Because if you look at its history, there have been crises and crises, and some far worse than what it's going through right now. I would think the relevance of my articles perhaps is also alerting people to the fact that there's always been this sort of debate, argument, and discourse in the ANC, perhaps not as heated as at present. I think also some of the ideas that are in there can contribute to present-day discourse. I think, well, in the end, it's going to be up to the readers to decide whether they are relevant. Maybe it's all passé. As you say, it's over 40 years. And stuff written 40 years ago might be totally irrelevant. But I think some of the stuff is extremely relevant. The last article in that collection has relevance for the present. I think there was something to do with African monarchs yesterday or day before something. The last article in that collection deals precisely with that issue. Again, very controversial views, but I think necessary to be inserted to the discussion.
That was Pallo Jordan discussing his book, Letters to My Comrades.